So I said that we would talk about the future of leadership. And this is primarily in the non-profit sector. There are bits which are relevant more widely, but this is specifically about us in the charity sector. And it's come from a number of conversations over the past few months, well, a lot of conversations over the past few months, but actually the genesis of these, the things that I'm going to share with you goes back a fair bit further than that. So I'm just going to give you 3 pieces of context, if I may, that have informed the thinking about what I'm going to share with you today. And the first one is the learning from COVID about ourselves and our own organizations. The second is the learning from COVID about outside of our organizations and about what's out there and the assets and the potential and the possibilities. And the third one is why that is so relevant to the future and what the future is likely to bring that makes that relevant. And then therefore I'll sort of draw that through to what I think that means for leadership in the sector, what are the kind of characteristics, and I'll ask for your thoughts on all of that. So if I begin with the reflections on coming out of COVID, one of the things that was really noticeable, so I started to do lots of calls with chief execs during COVID to just kind of help support them and bring them together. So they were all talking about so many common challenges with, the shift to online working and, sort of massive rise in need and changing the way that people have behaved and trying to get volunteers and, the explosion of volunteering, all that sort of stuff. And I'll come on to some of that more in a minute. But what was really interesting for me was as we came back out, so going back to kind of January, February 2021, I started being asked more and more, how can we harness what's just happened in our organizations? We've been incredibly agile. We've done systems changes that would have taken 6 months. We've done them in 6 days. Everybody has found solutions. Organizations have been so much more empowered. Boards have set up like little standing committees to give minimum oversight. Everybody's had so much, and we've achieved so much. How can we, as we go back to normal, this was, almost a sense of fear as people start to come back into the office, are we going to just click back into those old habits and we're going to slow right down and lose all of this potential that we seem to have unleashed over the last, over the previous 12, 14, 16 months. And some of the things that we'd seen, particularly about the way that we could deliver some of our services online remotely as opposed to necessarily in person, there were better ways of working. They showed the potential that came from that sort of clear and urgent need, combined with that, through necessity, that much higher level of empowerment and the alignment as well that came with just having these small number of really big challenges that we had to address in a very short space of time. So that was the sort of context for those questions. And it turns out that, well, there were 2 questions really. First one was, how do we retain all that stuff? And the second one was more pressing. And that sort of came more to the fore between sort of March, April, May, around the question of burnout. How do we cope with the level of fatigue? And I think remember people that were speaking to me back then, I did some sessions on this and shared the kind of the crisis response type curves and how, you have the honeymoon period, you have the heroic response, and you have the honeymoon period, and then the energy sort of dies down and people become sort of exhausted and the stress goes from sort of acute and useful to chronic and sort of debilitating. So those are the 2 questions. How do we retain all the great stuff? And how do we cope with burnout and the sort of the exhaustion in our organizations? And it turns out that through working through the first question, we started to find answers to the second question. So if I give you the example of one of the organizations that I worked with, and quite a few in this sort of space, we started to bring large groups of people from across the organization, not just a sort of executive team, but next tier down and sort of diagonal slices from across the organization together. Quite often we do a sort of survey in advance to capture their thoughts. But we really sort of pose them these questions. What are the problems that this new way of working has created for you? And then pass that back to them and said, so how could they be solved? If it was in your gift, how would you solve these problems? And they came out with an awful lot of very sensible, very pragmatic, quite simple solutions. And we asked them during that period of the pandemic, where did it show us at our best? What did you see in us that you'd not seen before? And they talked about that. And what were the best sort of changes that we saw, and how could we embed them? So we just asked the teams, this sort of crowdsourced this expertise, how could we embed them? And then we asked the sort of real kind of positivizing questions on the top of that. So if we could do all that during the crisis, and if we can keep raising the bar, what could we become? And where could we get to? And how high could we raise our ambitions? And every team that I did, I mean, got successively better as I think we got more practice at it. But every team that I did this with left those conversations, those half-day sessions or whatever, were feeling liberated, feeling energized, feeling empowered. And I got some of the most positive feedback from clients and in the sessions that I've probably ever had from those sort of sessions. So, and the energy that created, that sort of liberation, empowerment, that sort of sense, was huge. So that was one sort of thing of note to me, was the power of the empowerment that we saw during the pandemic, but also of just engaging people in those big questions around the future and how do we harness this, rather than seeing it as a sort of leadership, executive, chief exec conundrum to solve. We're just allowing the broader organization to surface these same questions, giving them a framework for drawing them out, and then passing the question back to them. So that was one of the first kind of big pieces of context for me in terms of this type of thinking. The second one was around one of the other things that I saw in the pandemic, and I'm sure there are people on this call, probably one or two of them, who noticed the number of organizations that started coming together and collaborating. There were a number of people in my network who were in parts of the sector that were quite fractious. I'm sure you know these. You know, there are sort of historic relationships between organizations that kind of play in the same space but don't play well together. One of the things that was really apparent during the pandemic was how many of these groups of charities, whether it was in the sort of advocacy space or the sight loss space or the veteran space or wherever it was, they actually started to cohere a lot more and have really good conversations with each other about common response, about how they could mobilize some of their collective resources. You saw it more with, I suppose, kind of nationals of a similar scale, but I also saw it and heard a lot more about it of sort of nationals and community organizations, where there's all historically quite a lot of friction as well, large and small. And this sense of the potential for collaboration and the potential to use, one of the other things we saw was this massive rise in volunteering during the pandemic. So much community volunteering, so many people, and some of the organizations managed to harness some of that with things like Good Sam app, and if anybody needs to know more about that, I think Angela, who's on the call, you could talk to them about what the collaboration's been doing in that sort of space. But this sense that there is a huge latent potential outside of our organizations that we can potentially tap into became quite vivid. And that keyed into some of the sort of longer term trends, things that I've been speaking to you about before, around the sort of system type strategies. And I'm not going to go into it in this call, but if you want to learn more about system strategies, just let me know. I've got a deck that I can share. I think I've recorded an old one of these on system strategies as well, which is where, rather than looking at your interventions, so for example, we have in many of our organizations, we might have a vision or a strap line that says, we believe that everybody should have a right to this kind of life, or that all animals should be able to live at . And yet within our organizations, most of our strategy is not based on that population of tens of thousands of people or animals or situations. It tends to be based on the few hundred or few thousand that actually link into our services. And one of the things that had been really a shift in thinking to the sector that's been emerging over the past 5-10 years has been this approach to looking at strategy in a more systemic way, about how do you create population level outcomes, and what does that mean for an organization that's different to one which is used to running programs and so forth. So this sense of there is a huge amount of assets and other organizational strengths out there. There's a latent power in the sort of mobilizing population that keyed in, certainly for me and for many of the organizations that I was talking to, with some of this thinking on population level outcomes and system strategies, which then speaks to some of the big challenges that we were facing at the time through the pandemic, but probably still are facing now, the sort of big systemic challenges. So those two things really stood out for me. One was around the power of empowerment, which I think intuitively we know, but to actually see it so tangibly in front of us. And then the second one was about this power of collaboration, of mobilization, whether it's between different organizations or into the sort of latent capacity of communities. So those two things I thought were really noticeable, and they formed part of the context for this. The third thing, which I will share with you, I've got a slide. I've got a couple of slides. I've got a lot of text on it, but there's a reason they've got a lot of text on them. And it's because I don't think you can overstate the challenges, the pace of change, the stuff that we're dealing with. And I know a few people came back to me with the article I wrote and the invitation I put out for this about, this is so what we're facing right now. But if I just talk through, so forgive me while I just sort of share a slide for a second, if I can remember how to do it. So what are we facing as an organization? And this is just, I think this is just a partial list as well. So there's a huge amount of political change that's been going on in the past few years. So, we don't have to roll back too far. There is obviously the post-pandemic situation, whether that's global or local or personal, with long COVID and all that sort of thing. And we're still seeing people sort of getting over this. There is potentially a whole load of sort of pent-up grief and frustration as well, still sitting there in this. There is certainly a kind of mental health and the physical health backlog to be worked through. International fragility, bear in mind I wrote this before Russia invaded Ukraine. But the scale of refugees, even back then, the level of sovereign debt that certainly kind of the more sort of G7 type nations, ours included, were racking up through the pandemic. This spectre of stagflation, which it appears, so we are now in, sitting on top of the whole legacy of post-austerity, 10 years of underfunding and retreat of the state, and the continual sort of tightening of funding. You've got this whole sort of post-truth thing is still there. It's there as much as it's ever been before. The erosion of trust in institutions, the conspiracy theories that are just rife. We know that, I don't want to keep pointing at particular areas, but I think something like 70+% of Republican voters in the US still believe that the election was stolen. You have very sort of populist and authoritarian shifts, and we're seeing these right now from the Lobbying Act through the crime bill, through the stuff on refugees, through what he's going through Parliament now on the Northern Ireland Protocol, which basically gives Henry VIII powers to most ministers for pretty much anything they want. And this isn't just in the UK. This is, these are global trends. We're seeing in the UK that continued marketisation of public services, and we're seeing certainly many of the areas that we work in, whether it's justice, health, or social care. The word crisis is not an overstatement of the situation there. Some of these sort of service areas, some of these sectors are virtually on the knees. And there are non-viability, areas of non-viability in those markets. We are seeing contracts being handed back at a rate of knots. And I'm not deliberately trying to paint a bleak picture, but this is an accurate representation of what's actually happening, what we're living through. And that's on the political side of things. We also have the sort of societal and economic shifts. So we've got this sort of economic polarization that we're seeing all the time, record inequality. Some of us, I'm sure, are working in this space with food banks, with increasing fuel poverty. Interest rates are likely to hit 10% with flat growth. That's what we call stagflation. Some of the disadvantages that we as a sector will probably have felt that we'd started to get on top of, and the marginalisation and the sort of intersectionalism, we're seeing those sort of receding. But we are also seeing a potential release of a lot of capital over the next 10, 15 years. There is a sort of demographic, there is an age band within the organizations, within society. It's most prominent in the US, but it's also the case here, of older people who have property that is accrued in value, who have money, who have savings, etc. We, as I assume will be, are not going to live forever. And so that kind of the boomer generation has a huge amount of assets right now, and they will probably be released at some point. There are other big trends in society, the impact of digitization. This is nothing new, but the pace of it is huge, particularly with social media. The parts of that sort of redrawing of community lines and ties is really positive, in the sense that, if I have an interest, I can find loads of other people with that interest. But I can also find loads of people with the sort of interest that you'd rarely get together. There's a whole movement of incels and sort of, deep alt-right, and the digitization has a huge sort of sociological impact. And I'm sure we're aware of it, but there's more to play out. Within there, you've got that sort of scandalization and cancellation that you saw Marcus Rashford get torn down because he happens to have 6 houses. So therefore, how can he be honest when he's helping, young people in poverty? There's the sort of the Daily Mail position, I suppose it is really, that you can't be rich and good. You must be a hypocrite. You can't be a chief exec of a charity and earn a decent salary, because that would be hypocritical. And all this stuff is still bubbling away. We have seen sort of green shoots of social consciousness, both active and tokenistic. You've seen kind of movements coming up, particularly over the past sort of 3-4 years. We also see major shifts in giving, seeing a lot of shifts in volunteering attitudes and behaviours, but still probably more so than ever, this need for human connection. So these are things which are all sort of shifting in the environment at the moment around us, that affect us and the stakeholders and the people that give us money. And then inside our organisations, we've got a whole other load of other stuff that we're probably still wrestling with around hybrid and remote working. I don't know whether everybody's got that fully nailed yet. Feels like some people have got that landed. But there's certainly a shift in employee expectations, and particularly in volunteer expectations as well. There's the sort of end of career great resignation thing that started to shake out. We've got this huge widespread skill and labour shortages. There are a number of factors there. People can point to, I guess, whatever they feel like pointing to, whether it's terrible management in organisations or whether it's Brexit or whether it's whatever it is. The fact of the matter is that large parts of our economy are missing skills, and many of you here will be working in the social care sector, and that's an area which is really, really short skilled. We've also got this shift in empowerment, as I was talking about before, different types of leadership coming through from the sort of traditional hierarchical leaders to more sort of servant leadership, compassionate leadership. We've got the need to create much more agile teams with change coming through. We've got the need to be comfortable working with much shorter time horizons. And all of these things are falling onto your shoulders as chief execs and leaders in the sector. How do you navigate all this? How do you navigate that sort of increasing balance of trust you need to place in employees rather than, and indeed within volunteers? These challenges around inclusion and EDI, and whether anybody's really got that right yet, what right even looks like. This pressure to continually professionalize but not get too business-like. And this, as I mentioned before, getting your head around this sort of emerging approach to thinking about strategy in terms of systemic change, sectoral challenges, those big issues, as opposed to just looking after another 20, 48 people next year. That sort of organic growth, this shift in perspective. So all of that stuff is swimming around, and we're all having to try and navigate all of that. And this is my key point: this is not over. That the pandemic might have felt like everybody's sort of waiting for new normal. And I'm sure we're all starting to recognize that now, the climate crisis hasn't gone anywhere. It may have taken a bit of a backseat for the last couple of years because we've had other fish to fry, but it's not gone anywhere. Cost of living crisis is now increasingly pressing. And, it was evident 3-4 months ago when I first started talking about this, but now it's really becoming noticeable. The global security crisis is increasing. And the refugee crisis, if you talk to people who've visited Ukraine and Poland and those areas, the fuel shortages out there are huge. The pressure on systems from all those refugees is massive. What that's going to mean come winter, we have no idea. And that's all sort of storing up and still got to play out. Cyber attacks, not just from the kind of Russian-Ukraine, but generally that seems to be, a huge growing area at the moment. Nationalism, civil unrest. These are the kind of conversations that people are now starting to have. How far away are these things? And are we going to have to face these? There could be more spikes of COVID. We've been lucky in the past few sort of waves have been more benign. And there's a whole bunch more, I suspect, that we've not seen coming. So Mark, to your point, you should feel good because all of this stuff is happening right now. And so far, we've been dealing with it. But there's come a cost. I know an awful lot of people are still exhausted and feel as though they're running on empty on this. And when I put up a slide like this and say, it ain't going to get any better, folks, it doesn't do a lot of good. But the fact is that if that is the future, we need to understand it and we need to prepare for it, because continuing to just walk on blindly into that kind of storm is not going to be good for anybody. And so my kind of conclusion here is that there will be waves of change and crisis that are coming for quite some time. And we need to sort of seriously think about what is a sustainable model for leading an organization, for running, the charity sector, the non-profit sector, in that kind of environment. We got through it in a pandemic. We were all knackered by the end of it. If this is now the sort of ongoing default state, what needs to change? Because stuff needs to change. So I'm just going to give you my thoughts on that, what does need to change and how we can shift into a different space of operating. And then I will pass it back to you and ask you 3 questions, and I'm going to post them in the chat now so that you can see them. But these 3 questions are: is this the direction we need to be traveling? And I've got this broadly right. And if you have other thoughts, then it'll be really useful to know them. What are the barriers that will stop your organization actually traveling in this direction? And what are the solutions or structures or support, whatever it is, to resolve those barriers? So first of all, is this the right diagnosis and hypothesis? And then the so what's around that. So firstly, I'm reframing the questions around, how do we make the best of this? How do we thrive in this environment, as opposed to how do we suffer through it and try and hold on to our sanity? And the first one is, what are the leadership models for this kind of rolling crisis? What does that look like? Can we sort of productionize our ability to fight fires and manage crises if that's what we know the environment that we're walking into? How do we maintain our teams and our people, our own well-being, this sense of kindness that we is the heart of our sector, and some degree of control over things, over events? And as a sector, how do we start to mobilize collectively against some of these challenges that are facing us at a national level? So those are the kind of questions that I'm thinking of. What are the solutions in this space? And there's 2 things I'm going to talk about first. And one is what this means for strategy, and the second is what this means for leadership. And I've talked about these in sort of previous conversations, that there is a long ongoing shift away from what strategy used to be back when I was a boy and, sort of learned strategy at the knee of whoever it was, that, you set out your plan for 5 years and then you worked through that plan. You did all your thinking up front, and then you did all your working, and you followed the steps. You have a massive Gantt chart that we draw for the next however many years. Fixed plans, fixed models of operation, fixed goals, and then you'd work them. That's not been the case for the vast majority of organizations, probably for the last 5 to 7 years. Very few organizations actually run a strategy like that in practice anymore. Most organizations set goals on a strategic time horizon, 3, 5, 7 years. And they might have a sort of fairly fixed approach to doing business, that we know how we're going to use and we know how we're going to work. But the plans are constantly adapting because the environment is changing. There's new competitors, new opportunities, there's new etc. So most organizations are more comfortable now working in that sort of adaptive space, where you know that the plan is going to evolve and change from year to year to year. So you don't plan too far ahead, but you still have those fixed goals and you still assume that your business model is going to be valid. The systems strategy is, again, more and more organizations are talking to me and working with me and working, independently of me on this sort of more sort of system visionary type strategy, where we're thinking about what needs to be true for this outcome to emerge at a broader level than us. So we have some fixed goals around the outcomes where we would like to, the Oxfam dollar a day type, that's our goal. We have a fixed goal. It's however many portion of the world population has an income above that point. But the models that we use, the how that we will deliver that outcome will have to change. And there's a lot of answers that we don't right now have. And so there's a lot of exploration in the strategy, a lot of trying new things, a lot of space for innovation. And the plans of what we're going to do will be continually evolving. And then you've sort of finally got this sort of fourth one, which is where you've basically given up any kind of planning and you just do whatever is opportunistic. But more and more organizations are playing in those centre two areas, and increasingly with the non-profit sector, people are looking at that sort of systemic strategy, which I think is right for the types of outcomes and the types of environment that we need to be working on. But in terms of leadership, the default model that's starting to arise now, and I'll talk to you about why this is in a second, is about a much more distributed approach to leadership. Because if, as a leadership team, you're spending more time in that sort of system visionary space, it means you're spending more time out there collaborating with other organizations, trying to build relationships with other chief executives, trying to steer the course, trying to influence whichever stakeholders, government agencies have a chance of shaping the broader outcomes for those kind of populations. You're going to spend much more time on that side, which means inside the organization, it's going to need to be able to be much more self-sufficient. And these are the three questions that I will often use to sort of diagnose how distributed is your leadership. Can your team run the organization, or if you're a department director, can your department run that department without you? So you disappear off for an extended period. Can they run it if you look flawlessly and they don't miss you? And that's great. Can they grow it? Can they grow your team? Can they grow your organization and deliver your strategy without you being there? Will they continue to pursue those strategic initiatives, keep them on track, or will they just default to running the day job and not look at the bigger picture? And then the third question is, can they change the organization? Can they evolve and refine the strategy as things change without having to come in and check in with you? That's the sort of level of distributed leadership we're likely to be looking for going forwards, because your focus is going to be much more distributed outside, looking at these big trends coming through and looking at the partner organizations that you're going to have to navigate them with. And I split this into a little 2x2 here, that in terms of what does leadership need to do? What is the fundamental requirement of it that can't be delegated? And I've looked at from the internal and the external perspective. And from an internal perspective, part of it, a lot of this came out of chief exec conversations, and a few of you here that probably even remember these words coming through from those conversations because you were in them. Part of the internal piece is trying to knit people back together post-pandemic to try and get your organization to cohere again and to work really well again. Part of it is also building that distributed leadership model. So you have really strong empowerment, very clear accountability, very clear ownership, but also a level of agility within the organization so that it can run itself and change itself and evolve itself, and that your people work really, really well together. And that's only a small part of your future role as a leader, because a large part of your future role is in the external. It's about collaborating with others and curating collaborations of other organizations, whether they're commercial organizations that can be influential, political organizations, or non-profit organizations, or a mixture of all three. And in terms of what does the leadership role look like externally, it's probably in that sort of system leadership space of you sort of trying to set the agenda, or not necessarily control the agenda, but planting the flag and saying, this is what we need to achieve collectively. These are the outcomes that we should be aiming for. How are we going to do it? And all of these things are a combination of basically getting the right people. So this is where I think the future leadership, if you only focused on two things as a leader in the future, it will be getting the right people and creating an environment in which they can thrive and achieve. And I know that sounds really simplistic, but in order to focus on that, you have to sort of largely let go of everything else. You end up being the person who is really just the champion of the vision, the values, the story of your organization, of your cause, and the story of change that you want to get people engaged with, then to provide the drive and energy behind all of that. Everything else is delegable to other people and will have to be delegable, because you've seen, the Mark's sort of comment and the crying eyes with all of this stuff coming and hitting us. You cannot be, in my view anyway, the sort of internally focused, hands-on leader that we used to have in the past, because change is just too fast. There is far too much stuff going on. There is too much stuff to manage externally, let alone internally, for you to do all of that. That has to be distributed. That has to be empowered around your organization in order to be able to do some of this stuff. So this is what I think, this is what I'm encouraging you. And this is where I'm going to sort of set you some questions and ask you what you think. But I think that in terms of that people environment, this is what you're going to be doing. This is what leaders of the future will need to be focused on. They will need to be focused on learning and teaching how to develop adaptive and system strategies, because that's where your organization will need you to lead. They will need you to be focusing on partnerships and collaborations, because longer term, that will become the strategic priority for achieving your bigger, more systemic type of outcomes. And there's, more broadly, for the sustainability of the sector in the face of some of these challenges that we've got coming towards us. And I think that your internal aspects will be around setting those kind of cultural and behavioral prerequisites, getting the right people and creating the right environment for work, which means moving their focus, certainly your senior teams, but anybody who's in that sort of, outward shell of the organization, getting them to focus outward rather than inward, getting them to just welcome, not just accept, but welcome change as a constant. And radical empowerment flows from that. If there is a lot of change around your organization, the people who are closest to that change need to be the people that have the power to make decisions to adapt it. It sort of follows from B. This planned and agile hybrid model, where some of your work you can plan further ahead, some of your work is going to be much more agile and much more iterative. You're going to have to understand that and teach your organization how to live in a world where different parts of the organization are working in very different ways, almost different paradigms of operation, whether it's one is working on a planned project, the other is working very sort of rapid action, agile teams. And how do people flow between those? How does information flow between them? And how do they align? And how do they learn to trust each other when they're almost like you've got different cultures working in your organization? You will want to start to set up the more sort of flexible types of capacity. RATs, rapid action teams, that's sort of an old commercial acronym, but people that you can pull together for a very short, call it sprint or very short project or whatever, to fix certain issues, which again, these are the kind of things that we saw happening in COVID because we had to, but they will become much more normal way for doing business. You'll need to probably be looking out for and getting your people to look out for much more kind of creative thinkers and problem solvers, particularly people who can think their way through complex problems, rather than people who require a sort of linear way of working that, they're told what to do and how to do it. You'll need much more thinking in your organization. You'll probably need more coaches, internal coaches for your people, and you'll probably need people who are better at collaborating externally and certainly much more orientated towards collaboration. Communication has always been a big deal, but not just sort of up and down and across within the organization, but in and out of the organization with partners will become increasingly critical. And this sense of candor and this ability to, you will need to move away from a team where all of their problems become your problems and you have to sort them out for them. You will have to move to a team that is what I would call conflict mature, that can resolve its problems and work through its conflicts happily and come out with a positive outcome where everybody's engaged. And a lot of these things are things that may exist in parts in your organization. But how do you get your whole organization to adapt to this kind of working practice, this sort of internal culture and behaviors? That will be, I think, the challenge, chief execs, because once you've got that in place, you're then free and your organization is then set to be able to operate in this kind of sort of very high change, high crisis environment that needs an awful lot of sort of agile collaboration with other organizations. So I'm just going to sort of pause there and I will pose you these questions and I'll put them in the chat so you've got them to keep. But just let me take that off. before I ask you to sort of feedback, because I know there's sort of a lot of people here, I'm going to just drop you into, if I may, into little breakout groups just for 10 minutes to talk this through and take your thoughts from this. And those questions particularly, do you buy this, what I'm saying, or is this sort of completely wrong direction? I can see that this is, I'm not saying, do you think you can do this overnight? What I'm saying is directionally, do you buy this? Do you buy into it? Or do you see it? Do you see it differently? In which case, well, what is the direction that you think we need to be traveling? How different is it to this? Where would you diverge? But if you do buy this, to the extent that you buy this, what are the barriers for you? And again, I've sort of had these conversations, so I've got a sense of what they might be, but I'd really like to hear your thoughts on that. What are the barriers? What's going to stop you from shifting in this direction, your organization? And then what are the sort of solutions that spring to mind around that? And that's what we'll talk about when you come back.
That was never 10 minutes.
No, it wasn't.
That's how you get past the introductions. I was just looking at the clock and thinking we could go for a while on it. But so what I'm going to do is I'll just sort of go through first question, really. I mean, was there anybody that felt that actually there is a different direction of travel that we should be pursuing? Or any groups or that came out with a radically different? No? Okay, so let's move through that one. So I assume you're all on board. So the on the question of the barriers, let me show you what I've heard, and you can add to this. So these are the typical ones which I hear back. So hopefully you can see that. Typical barriers to change. We don't have a burning platform like we had during the pandemic. So how do we get people motivated to make it a priority? But we just don't have the people to do this. We just lack the capacity within the organisation, too many vacancies. That we don't have strong enough kind of, whether it's the second tier down or the tier below you, to empower it. There's a sort of gap within our leadership capability. So sometimes what I hear is around lack of specific skills, whether it's to do with empowerment or to do with agile working. But there's also, I get the sense that there's a tension between it. People just want to be left alone to get on with their job rather than, being disrupted yet again and pushed to be more agile and pushed to take on more responsibility. So those are the ones which I've sort of already picked up. But what else came through in your groups that was significantly different to those? Feel free to talk about Lisa.
If I can say, just for me,
of course. And then
one staff member has constantly been saying to me, so what's going to happen? What are we going to do? And my honest answer has been, I don't know, but I'm okay not knowing. But that staff member, and I suspect a lot of others, are not okay with me not knowing, perhaps. So I think one of the secrets, and I don't know how one gets there, is to get staff members comfortable or more comfortable with me as chief exec, not knowing what's going to happen next year, not knowing how we're going to react to it, not knowing possibly what's going to happen and how we're going to react next week.
Exactly.
But I don't have a solution, just a...
No, you're absolutely right. Yes, that sort of lack of confidence in not knowing everything in the future. There is a learned helplessness that speaks underneath all of this, that people want the answers from you. I said, Lisa, it's the next.
Yeah, well, building in from that, actually, I think there's also a neurodiversity element here, and we need to be careful of aspiring to have everybody who's super agile, comfortable with change, able to sort of, think outside the box and not want that very structured way of working. I mean, in my experience, people's brains work differently, and that's not going to be everybody in your organization who's going to work like that. Indeed, you're going to need the strengths of those people who thrive in a more structured and more certain environment. So it's how you bring those along and not sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater, if you like, was one of the barriers that I raised, because I think, we're not all going to turn out being model, flexible, agile people. That's just not how everybody works.
No, and you don't build a house in an agile project way. You build it in a planned way. There are certain pieces of work, systems development, lends itself more to agile, but infrastructure development lends itself more to planned. So there are going to be parts of your organization, and what you put your finger on is how do those coexist within the same organization, and how do you find the square pegs for the square holes and the round pegs for the round holes? And how do you manage the challenges and conflicts that will emerge between those two different cultures within the same organization? That's a very good point, Mark.
I was reflecting on one of the things I've learned over the last sort of 3 years, and that is there's so much senior management time spent trying to coordinate and manage a range of activities that you probably shouldn't be doing in the first place. And so saying no, being really clear about what you're going to be good at, and saying no to all those opportunities that you're not going to be very good at, because actually most of your time is spent sorting out things that you cock up. And so if you know what you're good at, if you focus on what you're good at, it helps you identify the people you want to collaborate with more effectively. And it also helps you collaborate internally more effectively because you know what everyone's good at. So for me, I think it's about saying no to the stuff that you're not going to be very good at and really focusing on stuff that you're good at.
And that's a solution to the capacity barrier, isn't it? Absolutely. It's so much time we spend on doing remedial and failure work, fixing stuff that we screwed up. Sophie?
I think for me, there's something about imagination and how do we value that and get people to envisage the future. So I was saying in our group, COVID was one of these very low likelihood, high impact events. Yes. If I look back at my last 4 years, I have gone through a series of 3, possibly 4 low likelihood, very high impact events, and they compound on each other. So there's something about the capacity to kind of really imagine into the future when things are going on around you that you kind of think, shit, where did that come from? Yeah. And I don't think we value that ability. I take the point about we need people who can work in a structured way and people who work in a less structured way. I think that's right. But I think there is something about making sure we've got the capability to imagine. And I'm not sure that we necessarily value that sufficiently all the time.
I think if we valued it more, we would create more space for it. And one of the things that we tend not to do within our organizations is because that feels like a luxury, even for ourselves to just daydream. That feels like a bit of a luxury.
I mean, don't get me wrong, you do then need to turn it into something concrete, but
Of course, let's go to rationalist always wins. But yes, well, here's the thing. Let me share you back, and then, if this builds on this, feel free to venture them. So I will just sort of share back. This is where I've got to with this. That there's 4 areas that we need to properly look at. The first one is around creating a sense of priority, that things need to change, whether that's to do with accommodating different styles of working in the planned and the agile and how that's going to work, and to formalize a framework or some kind of conception of this, whether it's the space to think imaginatively about the future. There's some of the most interesting stuff that I've been doing recently is instead of doing scenario planning, we do live scenario working, because that rather than it's an intellectual exercise, it's actually quite a immersive exercise then. And you walk away thinking, wow, we really need to prepare for this in a different level, very experiential. But that creating urgency around this, investing in capable capacity, because if that's a barrier for you, I think Mark's point is exactly right, though, that there's more than one way of creating capacity in an organization. And one is just to stop doing a whole load of stuff and focus on the stuff that you're really good at. And that could be really, really hard because there's a lot of, people are often invested in certain things that are there for a legacy reason. But getting the right skills to deal with complexity and adaptability, getting the right skills to focus on collaboration, that sort of behaviors, what are the behaviors, cognitive behaviors as well around sort of diversity and the value of having different sort of neurodiverse or culturally diverse or sort of experientially diverse perspectives. And how do you work through the conflicts? How do you develop more conflict maturity in your organization, the foundation of trust, foundation of the sense that we're all trying to solve this and we're all listening to each other? And then that sort of ongoing learning, how do you cultivate those in the organization? Because they are going to be worth gold in the sort of, over the next few years. And bringing in things, one of the big differences I've made is just giving people a language around this stuff. can be really helpful, concepts and that sort of thing. I think it's a major step to actually sit down as a senior team and decide to reorientate your roles, and therefore to work through the implications and consequences of that. That we will need to be much more externally focused on with these other things. These are the 5 different things that we're going to be focusing on, and this is how we're going to share them out. And that now becomes a core part of our jobs, 40-60% of what we do. And that triggers a recognition that the cultural empowerment is going to be increasingly important. So it's how do you get this stuff onto the table? And then number 4, how do you create the space? This is one of the things which I think this is the easiest thing to do, but it's probably the most powerful thing to do, is to create the space to have the big conversations, whether it's with you, with your senior team, whether it's more broadly with the organization. But one of the chief execs in one of the earlier conversations I had about this made this observation that this is much bigger than just a change. This is about organizational development at a more transformational level. It's not about going into a workshop and thinking about how do we solve this, or having an away day. It's about an ongoing process. But how do we create space on a regular basis to have these big conversations, to work through the differences of opinions and in the conflicts that throw out? So those are the kind of solutions, and I will add in Mark's stuff about stop doing things, because I think that's really good, and I would fit what Sophie said into that, creating space for the bigger conversations, because that's a bigger conversation as you create that effective imagination. But I'd be interested to know, so that's my kind of, top 4. When you talked, I know I didn't give you an awful lot of time, but when you talked about that sort of solution space, about how do we actually make this stuff happen and get past these barriers, what else did you come up with? Where else did you go?
We didn't get to that stage. Unfortunately.
That's quite all right. I didn't give you a lot of time. I did set you up for failure. Petra.
Apologies if there's no picture on there. I don't know what's happened to my computer. I think we didn't get to that stage either. But one of the things that's dawning on me, Martyn, as you're going through the list of points, is that in navigating our way through this, the timing and your sense of where the organisation is feels really important. And there are, having that kind of finger on the pulse of the organisation at all levels, and knowing when you can push a bit harder and when you need to step back, is something that I really feel at the moment I'm sort of navigating and looking for those windows of opportunity. So, you may have a plan for the month or the next 3 months, but sometimes opportunities come up a bit sooner than you expect. And sometimes it just doesn't feel like the right time to push something forward. And I think just really having a sense of that, for me, is kind of much more important now than it was a few years ago. I would be interested to know if other people feel the same.
From my conversations, I think they do. Yeah. I think there's good points, very well made. There's a degree of sort of agility and context awareness to this. Peter.
Yeah, just quickly, I was saying it. We didn't get to it either because you didn't give us enough time, Martyn. But no, seriously, I joined the organisation last January. So I was saying in our group that I spent the kind of first 5 or 6 months just looking at people like I'm looking at you now, just head and shoulders. But one of the things that we did was to review the strategy that was, and also look at how COVID had impacted us. So I'm a big fan of Simon Sinek, who asked the question really, what is your why? And back to a couple of points that have been raised, that the importance of actually working out what it is we are to do in the current climate is that when we know what we are supposed to do, it enables us to then know what we are not supposed to do. So that allowed us as an organisation to stop doing 1 or 2 things that really were not part of our core. And out of that process, I was quite fortunate because, as I say, I started last year and went through the whole reviewing the strategy type thing, but we came up with a completely new plan, taking COVID on board and also what the organisation was there to do inside the COVID crisis, really. I think it's a really good framework. Just outside, I'm just looking at the time. Wow, this has flown. That Simon Sinek framework of why, how, and what is a really useful framework. It's useful in terms of strategy, because your why is your vision. Why do we exist? We exist because we believe in a world X, Y, and Z.
Your how is really about, so therefore, what are the roles your organization is best positioned to play within that? Is it about service delivery? Is it about innovation? Is it about influencing? Is it about working through others? There are different roles that you can play. And that's the how. How will we play into that vision? And then therefore the what follows from that. So therefore, what are we going to do? And more importantly, what are we going to need to become in order to play that role? So it's really useful for that, but it's also really useful for thinking about empowerment, which is at the heart of a lot of this. How do you empower people? There is a difference between telling people what to do and asking people, this is why we're doing it. I want to talk to you about how it can be done. What are your thoughts on how? So by engaging people at different levels between the what, moving that conversation up to the how do you think we should do it? And moving that conversation back up to the why. This is why we're doing this. What are your thoughts on that? And just opening that breadth of conversation to people, moving them back up that almost Simon Sinek ladder can be really, really helpful. I will invite you all to, you've all got my email address because I've all replied to you all with this. Send me your thoughts on what you've heard today. I'm going to do 2 or 3 of these sessions in autumn. So I'm going to go away for a little while and get some sun. But sort of September, October, November's time, I'm going to probably do 3 of these, 1 a month. If there's stuff that's come out of this session that you'd really like to explore more, drop me a line. I find that really helpful. If you want to pay me back for the last wonderful hour of content that you've had, just drop me a note and tell me the kind of things that you think should be focusing on in those autumn sessions, and I'll see if I can pull something useful together. And you will all get invites to it. How's that sound? Excellent. In that case, thank you everybody for joining me, and I will hopefully see you after the summer. Enjoy the sun. I'll see you all soon.
Martyn.
Take care.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Martyn. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Martyn.